Love is the greatest healer. I'm so fortunate to know love and to have survived my experiences, to be here tonight to speak out on the subject of mind control. Thank you, all of you, each and every one of you, for coming out here to arm yourself with this pertinent information. Love is the greatest motive for me to speak out on this subject because it is my love for humanity that compels me to bring this truth to light. I'm deeply concerned for our survival if we don't learn this information. The experience that I had could have left me very bitter and vengeful and hateful, but it is none of those negatives that compel me to speak out at all, because I find that those kind of negatives actually hinder my ability to even think clearly. If I'm outraged, I'm not even capable of thinking so well. Besides, negativity tends to feed the energy of the criminals that are in control of our government right now, manipulating the minds of all of us. Now that I'm free to speak out, and now that I know love, it feels so good to realize that there are good people in this world, that there is good and bad running through everything. Here we are speaking in a church, and yet a church was so much a part of my abuse. So again, there's good and bad in everything. There's good and bad in government. There's good and bad even in the CIA. Mark Phillips is some powerful evidence to me that there are people in intelligence who have integrity and soul and compassion. And that was a real eye-opener for me, because my whole world was covered in abuse. My whole world was one where I couldn't see beyond my experiences of the moment. I couldn't even think to hope anymore. I lost that ability at about age 6. How it happened was that I was born into a multi-generational incest-based family like so many other people are. There's certainly nothing rare about it. Child abuse is so pervasive on our planet. All we need to do is open our eyes and look around us to see how widespread that it is. The sexual abuse that I experienced left my sexuality heightened, which is very common in a situation like that. And I'm sure that Dr. Lois Lee has seen so many of these children that, like myself, end up on the streets as prostitutes with their sexuality being exploited even further because of abuse that they'd already endured in childhood. It's absolutely atrocious, the extent of the abuse that's going on for systematic, deliberate reasons, and for reasons that have just become a so-called norm, a natural part of our society, because after 3 generations of an attitude of sexual abuse, it becomes autogenic within a family unit. That's why I said that I'm from a multi-generational incest-based family. My mother was sexually abused, my father was sexually abused, and the sexual abuse just goes all up the family tree. I don't see that as their excuse for abusing me sexually whatsoever. I ended up with like a 100th monkey syndrome, is something where I didn't have that natural propensity to continue that abuse or to even accept it and to think that it's the way things should be. As a matter of fact, it was so traumatic to me that I developed dissociative identity disorder, formerly termed multiple personality disorder. It's not that I could think to judge my father when he abused me. It wasn't like that at all. I mean, I was so very young. It happened as far back as I can remember, and he often bragged that he substituted his penis for my mother's nipple. So it was very early on. I also know that my father was like that with my brothers and sisters that came along in later years. So it was way before I could morally judge such a thing, or before I had any kind of mental concept of how life should be. Instead, my brain automatically kicked in. When the abuse occurred, it began to compartmentalize the trauma of that event so that the rest of my mind could function normally. My father's sexual abuse of me was horrific because it suffocated me and it caused a lot of pain as a very, very young infant. At the same time, it put my sexuality into a survival mode that was the equivalent of breathing or eating or drinking. It was just became a very strong base instinct. The Hitler-Himmler research had already determined that this was what happens in the human brain when anytime abuse occurs. And when abuse occurs, where the brain begins to section off the abuse so the rest of the mind can function normally, there becomes less and less conscious mind to be able to think through exactly what is happening. They were very much interested in this because if the traumas are repeated enough and there's enough compartmentalization created in the brain, then the subconscious mind is left wide open to being manipulated and easily led. That was what they wanted for mass mind control in a society. It's what they wanted for that kind of Manchurian candidate attitude, and for being able to manipulate, ultimately, the politics of the planet as well as the population as a whole. These experiments that Dr. Ross referred to were so heavily going on when I was born in 1957 that by the early 60s, mind control was in full swing. The CIA was taking information from what the Catholics had long since learned about the effects of trauma on the human mind when they did the Spanish Inquisition and the Crusades, and they found out how people responded to that kind of trauma, that kind of torture. And it was so strong on the population, as a matter of fact, that it ended up where the few free thinkers that were left went underground, and secret societies began forming and spinning off that. I'm not saying secret societies are right or that they're good, but they came from horrible, torturous abuse that was going on, that was trying to control people and steer them into one belief rather than leaving them to their own normal development. Project Paperclip had already happened, and the Nazi and fascist scientists from Hitler's Nazi Germany were brought into the United States, and the information was being combined with this information from the Catholics that the CIA was combining into a very powerful form of mind control. The MK-Ultra mind control projects were very strong, but they weren't just experimental at the time that I was in. They were already absolute. They knew exactly what they were doing. And they even had it established where they had a certain faction of the government set up to target children like my dissociative identity disorder, where the memory of the abuse was compartmentalized into those different compartments. Along with that compartmentalization comes a 44 times visual acuity, because it's like you get these eyes in the back of your head to see if the abuse is coming. And when people have been horribly traumatized, you'll notice that their eyes are wide open, and very often you see the whites around their eyes. Their blink responses aren't even proper, but that's because the body is going into this mode of, trying to stop the problem before it happens again, or is trying to stop the traumas and the horrors before they occur again. Additionally, we use 10% of our brain. I've heard figures 8 to 10% of our brains is about what we use. Well, when you have that kind of abuse, it blasts you into other parts of your brain. And so you end up using other parts that most people never get to because they don't even know that it exists yet. Because the information that's so important to know about our own brains, that we all have a right to know, have been suppressed for so-called reasons of national security, so that the information can be used to control us instead of to let us know what our brains are capable of. Our brains are capable of far more than we ever dreamed, and I feel really fortunate to have survived my ordeal, to know what our brains can do and to be able to exercise mine and use mine for freely in the ways that everyone should know we can do, such as the 44 times visual acuity. I recently used that when I was diagnosed with cataracts, and I was going to have cataract surgery and all, and I thought, if I can have 44 times visual acuity, why can't I fix this part of my eyes? When I went in for the pre-examination set up for the surgery, my eyes were 100% cured, and they have stayed that way. Those are little things that we can do because of what we're capable of, that instead we're being just manipulated by, and that kind of information is being kept from us, because 44 times visual acuity is a very important factor for the government to be able to pluck children like myself and put them into military intelligence or military special forces, because they can shoot and not miss a target. Their vision is so precise. Additionally, when a child is abused and they begin developing these compartments in the brain, as more and more compartments develop on the subconscious level and the conscious mind is being pushed out of the way, where there's no capacity for question, reason, conscious awareness, and conscious thought. Because when you're operating in these different compartments, for example, the one that developed because of my father's sexual abuse. When my father would come in and to sexually abuse me, the same part of my brain that was familiar with that would open up, so that he would do it again and again as needed, and yet it would still remain compartmentalized in this section. Our brains are phenomenal. So that the rest of my mind could function normally. Well, that part of my brain would open up for my father's sexual abuse. Then my father began prostituting me. My mother's father had a Blue Masonic Lodge. He ran a Blue Masonic Lodge in, up in Michigan, and it was where the politicians were just real, local politicians were just real active. And my father began prostituting me out to different ones who were aware of the child abuse, because of the knowledge coming through on CIA mind control and being so much a part of a criminal faction of our government that's also referred to as the shadow government, that was slowly gaining control and finally gained control with the Kennedy assassination. They'd already got a pretty good control, but they really took a major control over the population, because, like I was telling you, when trauma occurs, then the brain has a way of kicking in to deal with trauma. And most people who are old enough to know exactly where they were and what they were doing at the time that John F. Kennedy was assassinated. It traumatized the nation. It traumatized the nation to see it on TV over and over and over again. That trauma left people suggestible, left that subconscious open to where they were highly suggestible and easily led. And that was the beginning. Consider what I'm saying with the effects of what happened 9/11 or 9/11 as it's referred. I refer to it as 911 because that's the emergency number, and they like to do those kind of number games anyway. It was also flight 11 at 9, so they were playing that with the numbers, but nevertheless, on 9/11 the whole nation was traumatized. And in that trauma, people became suggestible. And how many people ran out and bought a flag, because that was what we were told to do. And the compliance of the people at that time was so strong, and it gave the shadow government a firm control over all of us that is just finally now shaking. It's finally starting to stop because people are waking up, and they're waking up en masse. And it's happening all over this country. Mark and I travel outside this country, and we're thrilled to see how much more wide awake and aware the rest of the world is at this point, where they have a compassion for people in the United States, knowing that we are not our government. We are not that shadow government that's taken over, that the people here are rising up, they're gaining voice, and they're standing strong by issues of 9/11 and taking action in their own communities. Mark and I have been speaking out on mind control for over 20 years now. That's a long time to be speaking out on the subject. We've seen a vast difference between when we first started speaking and now. People are waking up, and it's awareness that is that we've got to have. We've got to keep this awareness going, because knowledge is our only defense against mind control. The compartmentalization of memory that I was talking about, where when my father began prostituting me to these political people as well, developed more compartments in my brain. It was like, oh, well, where do I turn? You know, I can't even turn to our local law enforcement. I can't turn to politicians. And, you know, I really felt that there was nowhere to go, and my brain automatically began compartmentalizing. Further, when my father began doing child pornography of me and sold it through the local Michigan Mafia child pornography ring, that criminal faction of the government, that shadow government that was monitoring such things as those child pornography rings, we didn't have internet back then, the child pornography rings, to target children like myself for MK Ultra mind control. And of course, I'd mentioned that Blue Masonic Lodge, and one of the members there was a local politician named Gerald Ford. Of course, this is the same Gerald Ford that went into the office of president, and was very much a part of how I ended up being used on a White House Pentagon level during the Reagan-Bush administration. But he was interested this criminal faction was interested in children like myself, because when you have so many of those compartments, there's no continuity of thought anymore. If you operate in this compartment and have no memory of it, operate in this compartment and have no memory of it, there's no way to have any continuity of thought bridging, and there's no ability to have any continuity of time. You don't have a concept of time at all. I didn't know. I began to lose my whole perspective on time, how long anything was. This is something that they were also interested in. They know it's a phenomena of the brain, because when a person doesn't know how long they've been doing something, the physical endurance is tremendous. You don't get tired if you don't know you're supposed to be tired. So it creates a physical endurance that's really good for military special forces, military intelligence, or the kind of political prostitution that I was eventually used in the course of the kind of missions that I was forced to carry out in later years. So this local politician, who was just one more pedophile to me, came to the house and told my father that he could receive immunity from prosecution if he would agree to sell me into the CIA's mind control project. My father agreed to it, was actually pretty thrilled about it, thinking, wow, you know, the government condones child abuse, this is wonderful. He excitedly agreed to it, had 5 more children afterwards just to raise in the project. So there were 7 of us children in the family and all. But as soon as my father agreed, he was flown to Boston, Massachusetts for a course on how to manipulate the subconscious mind. Since it was my subconscious mind that was open, he was taught how to do it in speaking in literals, where a person would take things very literally. He also was instructed that he would have to take me to certain places at certain times, so that I would be in the right place for whatever the CIA's mind control operations were conditioning me for, and eventually the ones that I would be working in. Boston, Massachusetts is a real key epicenter place to mention because, as I'm sure all of you have heard, that's where the Catholic child abuse scandal was right there out of Boston, Massachusetts. Look at the vast numbers that you have heard about that have been sexually abused within a Catholic church. It wasn't homosexuality. They made a really huge effort to make it look like homosexuality when in fact it's pedophilia. They just love to put those kind of emotional diversions out there to try to divide the people instead of get right to the truth, because truth unites us. It's all those lies and false attitudes that end up dividing us and creating problems. So I was raised in the Catholic Church. I had been all along. Our church in Muskegon, Michigan was actively involved with the CIA on mind control. I certainly wasn't the only one. As a matter of fact, I thought it was the way life was because everybody I knew, there was some horrible abuse going on. It's like it was a way of life in Muskegon, Michigan. It has since been termed the pedophile capital of the United States. That came out in the Muskegon Chronicle, and it's a widely known fact. Muskegon, Michigan is a horrible place to have come from, but it really gave me the idea that that's the way the whole world was, when in fact, obviously, it's not. But neither are all Catholics bad. You know, I've certainly learned since then that there are Catholics who are very determined to bring that criminal activity out of the church and bring it back to whatever. And it's supposed to be, when you consider the Crusades and the Spanish Inquisition, man, it's quite a history of it they've got to undo there. But nevertheless, there are some people that are aware and are making a difference. But for me, it only added more compartments to my brain because then I was subjected to occult ritual. Occultism is a horrible blood trauma that certainly created more compartments in my mind. The Catholic aspect was just one more horrible thing to know. Well, you know, you can't even turn to a church for help. And it's been all these years before finally even the child abuse began to shake the very foundations of the church. And yet they were still, you know, diverting things. I mean, whoever heard my name with that Catholic child abuse scandal? I mean, I certainly wasn't able to be part of any lawsuits, even though the ones that were prosecuting it referred to our book, Access Denied, for reasons of national security because of the pertinent information in there on not only why that kind of child abuse was going on, but how to heal from it, because there's a lot of people that need help, and to be able to heal from varying levels of child abuse, of sexual abuse, varying levels of the suggestibility and ultimately mind control that is resultant from those traumas. My father was also told to take me to the governor's mansion in Michigan, which was located in Mackinac Island, and the governor at the time was George Romney. Of course, Mitt Romney is his son, and that's very important to know. We need to pay attention to our politics because it's not about naming a certain name so that you know who these people are, because it's just going to replace them with somebody else. And now we've got generations. George Romney was the one who was part of my victimization. He's the one who was actively involved in merging Catholic information with the CIA information on mind control in order to bring it into a more powerful form of mind control, which combined with technology, which we have today, combined with technology, was the most powerful form of mind control that was being brought into the Mormon church. And the Mormon church was something I was exposed to later on, and it is a very powerful form of mind control. That one needs to clean up their mess next. But pay attention to these so-called politicians we're getting paraded in front of us as something new and something different, because, in fact, that's just not the way it is. I met my owner, who had become my owner in the CIA's mind control project, U.S. Senator Robert C. Byrd. Senator Byrd has been in office as long as I've been alive. I can't believe he's still in office today. He's been head of Senate Appropriations. As head of Senate Appropriations, he decides where money is going to be spent and how. As my owner, Senator Byrd directed my activities during the Reagan-Bush administration when I worked on a White House Pentagon level. Senator Byrd is funding the mind control mechanism in our school systems. He has funded the so-called, he was the one who introduced the so-called Clean Air and Water Act, which in fact I watched all those years where he just lined his pockets with buy-offs so people could pollute and destroy the environment and destroy our planet even more. We need to pay closer attention to what these politicians are doing, especially when they've been in there so many years that they know how to play the game. This is the shadow government that's been manipulating us all. Going back on Gerald Ford, as Gerald Ford went, as his political career escalated into the office of the presidency, notice who was in his cabinet. I certainly did. I was exposed to him from the mid-'70s throughout my whole victimization. He had Dick Cheney as his Secretary of State, Donald Rumsfeld as his Secretary of Defense, George Bush Sr. as head of the CIA. I knew Dick Cheney from the mid-'70s when I was first taken out to Wyoming to where his hunting ranch is, where he embarked on his most favorite game, called the most dangerous game of human hunting, where a person is hunted. I had no clue whether or not I was going to live. How would I know that? And I was subjected to horrible, brutal tortures by Dick Cheney repeatedly throughout my victimization. And now he's acting like, oh, we just started torture after 9/11. Who believes that? Come on, this has been going on forever. That was his excuse to just traumatize a nation and allow for further control over the people. There's a whole lot more torture that's going on than waterboarding. And there's a whole lot more even to waterboarding than what we see on TV. My daughter Kelly has even drawn pictures, graphic detail of waterboarding. Once Mark rescued Kelly and I out of the horrible experiences that we endured. She was taken into the custody of the state of Tennessee, where she was abused further by the so-called mental health system, while national security was put all over her case, and her records are still sealed for so-called reasons of national security. Were they not sealed, you would see her graphic pictures of waterboarding. I wonder if those are the kind of records Dick Cheney wants out there, to see what my daughter endured. My daughter is still suffering the effects of the tortures that she endured. She's waiting on good people like yourselves to wake up and make a positive difference. In the meantime, she and I made every difference that we possibly could in the state of Tennessee. We plowed through them all, letting them know what mind control was. And we had over 1 million letters pouring in to the governor of the state of Tennessee from people all over the world saying, what does national security have to do with a documented rape and molestation of a child? That was a wonderful thing to do. It made a big difference. It made a big difference in the state of Tennessee. It made a big difference within the system. It raised awareness, and it started making that difference. We sure didn't get it from the top on down, because they're still covering it up. They're still covering up the tortures, are still covering up mind control. And it's got to stop. The truth needs to come out, and it needs to be brought to light for Kelly's sake and for everyone's sake. We all need to know the magnitude of what's really going on in our world. Because Dick Cheney, George Bush Sr., not George Bush Jr., he was absolutely under mind control in the same projects I was, and he was even in the most dangerous going. That's why he comes off so dense. He's really not the one. We need to go behind the scene, because the CIA has been running it behind the scene, or the shadow government has been running behind the scenes for too many decades now. And now that awareness is rising, and people are waking up to the point where they even have to say torture on TV, where it's finally coming out, there is that hope that maybe people will begin to research further and look into what's really happening, because that torture issue is like a little hole in the dike of what's really behind all of it, and that truth needs to start pouring forth. We need to get it out. I'm so fortunate to have survived it. I have so many stories that I could share with you about the different operations that I was used in, the horrible tortures that I saw that go far beyond waterboarding. Those are in graphic detail in our book, Transformation of America. Trans was written when national security was slapped on our case, and it was written so that that information would be out there. It's comprehensive detail, but it's very graphic detail. And for someone who's been victimized, they don't need to know that. They need to know their own truth before they know someone else's. They need to find that truth. And Access Denied was written for them. It was written for the population that's been traumatized by 9/11. It's for a population that's been traumatized by watching these criminals in control of our government making us look like something we're not to the rest of the world. It's these people who've been traumatized by everyday life, by what's happening in their own lives with the economy. It's for people who are horrified by the abuse that they're seeing going on around them. It's for every one of us, because this is a rough planet. And it will teach you what I learned. It will teach you the truth that I found. Once I healed from my mind control victimization, and once I remembered all the details of all those government operations that I was tortured to forget. Now, they weren't extracting information. I said tortured to forget. Dick Cheney knows, and I know he knows it because he's done it to me. Dick Cheney knows that torture is to make people forget and to program them with anything that's put into their subconscious mind at that time. And those were the kind of operations that I was forced to do. You certainly can't extract information that way. There's a whole lot of other technologies out there. There's a whole lot of other methods out there that do work, that are very simple. They don't need to torture. There's no excuse for torture other than to traumatize people, traumatize a nation, and to control a mind. It's got to stop. Dick Cheney has got to be stopped. It's up to all of us to be able to make that difference. Bringing Dick Cheney down is not going to stop the shadow government. Bringing Dick Cheney down is not going to stop torture. It's not going to stop the shadow government. It's not going to make the changes that we need in this world. It's not enough. It's already too big. They've been at this too long. Instead, it's up to each and every one of us to make that change within. When I woke up from mind control and I realized that there's good people in this world, I had hope again. When I woke up from mind control, I woke up to realize that there was a form of mind control that blanketed society where people were really dumbed down. It was like I came running out of hell saying, there's mind control, you know, and help my daughter, help me. And yet, nobody knew what it was. It was like I was screaming about a hell and nobody could even see it. It's like, how can this be? And I realized that people had been dumbed down and they'd been conditioned. And that what I had seen that could be done technologically was actually being implemented. What I knew when I worked under Bill Bennett, Ronald Reagan's education secretary during the 80s, that they were bringing the mind control into the school system in order to increase the children's learning capacity while decreasing their ability to critically analyze. That's what's been eroding at our society for so long now. And I woke up to that and went, wow, I got to share this information. This is important that people understand exactly how our brains really work. They know how our brains work, and they're manipulating us by that knowledge. Knowledge is our only defense against mind control. We need to take that knowledge. I could talk for hours, and there's still more for you to research. And I encourage each and every one of you to please do it. I encourage each and every one of you to share the information with those that you love and people that you meet. And start sharing information in Access Denied. Access Denied is helping people heal from all levels of mind control from all over the world. It was written out of demand and a need from people who were reaching out for help because they knew that Mark and I understood. And so we finally wrote sufficient enough that anyone can take it and transpose that information to their own need and heal from any level of abuse or control. People in military special forces are using it. People all over the world are using that information, and they're healing. And with that healing is coming more and more awareness. And as that awareness is rising, the word is spreading. And people are beginning to have grassroots activism. There's people standing strong in this room who have stood by what really happened on 9/11. And thank you for doing it. Keep doing that. We all have to stand strong by what we know. Keep those grassroots growing. Everyone, please take the information and spread the word, because knowledge is our only defense against mind control, and this is the truth that makes us free. Thank you.
Thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks to Roseanne Barr. We deeply appreciate each and every one of you coming out tonight, and we hope that you'll take this information with you and share it with someone you love.